So another type of bass trap that you might have come across while searching on the internet for a solution to the bass problems in your home studio is a Helmholtz Resonator. You build a box, drill some holes in it, put it in the right spot, and boom, it just kills that standing wave that is causing that massive peak in your frequency response. The thing is that in all the years that I've been building studios, I haven't seen a single successful implementation of a Helmholtz Resonator in a home studio. And in this video, I'm going to show you why. Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticSinsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And this is week 5 in my bass trap breakdown series, where I look at all the different types of bass traps out there, cut through the nonsense, and hopefully allow you to make smart and evidence-based decisions about the acoustic treatment in your studio. Now, if you haven't checked it out yet, this whole series is accompanied by my complete guide to bass traps and bass trapping that you can download completely for free at the link in the description. It's basically an encyclopedia of all the different bass traps out there, from phone wedges to tune devices that we're talking about in this week's video. And it's all neatly organized for you so that you can reference it at any time. So obviously how to identify them and causes of confusion, how to use them, when to use them, how many you need, and the pros and cons of each. So let's get right into it. How do you actually identify a Helmholtz Resonator? Well, just like all pressure devices, it is first and foremost a sealed box. And then in this case, it's covered with some type of panel with holes or slots in it. And it's really the ratio of these holes in relation to the surface that they're drilled into that determines at what frequency they work. So this distinguishes slotted panels, for example, typical slotted panels, and also perforated panels with very small holes from actual Helmholtz resonators used for bass trapping. And that's because you need a much larger ratio of holes to surface area in order for these to work so low down. So if you see anything that has very small holes and slots, it is a Helmholtz resonator, but these are usually meant to work at low, mids, and mid frequencies, and that's not what I'm covering in this video. So here's a quick example, one of the few, actually the only one that I could find that is commercially available, the Very Bass Ultra by Acoustic. And so you can see in this case, it's not a box, it's a tube that you can lengthen in order to tune this device. And then it has 5 big holes drilled into the top panel. And that's where the sound will enter and basically make this device resonate. So as I mentioned before, these are pressure absorbers and not velocity absorbers. And they basically work just like any type of resonance device. So you have a mass spring system, and the mass basically oscillates on top of the spring. In this case, the mass is actually the air in the holes, and the spring is the air inside the cavity. They're tuned by the size of the cavity, basically the volume of the box, and then the number of holes, the size of the holes, and also the length of the actual tunnel that is formed by drilling through the top sheet, by perforating that top sheet. In practice, that creates a very high Q or low bandwidth absorber. And here's a model of what that typically looks like. So this one, I basically tuned this to 30 Hertz as an example. You can see just how narrow that peak of absorption is. And that is because these devices really only resonate at one particular frequency. So in terms of how to actually use them in your studio, they are very sensitive to positioning, just like all the pressure devices that we looked at. Maybe even more sensitive, because the position of the hole in relation to the sound wave hitting this thing actually makes a huge impact. You have to identify the target frequency that you are planning to absorb. So typically a standing wave resonating in your room. Then you figure out where this particular frequency has areas of high pressure. And then that's where you want to place this Helmholtz resonator in order to absorb that sound wave. Now, so far, this all sounds really good, but as so often, the problems only appear when you try to put this into practice in the actual reality of your room. And for us home studio people, it's as so often the problem with actually designing and constructing this thing correctly, because there are almost no options to buy these things off the shelf apart from the acoustic Varitube bass trap that I just showed you. And here we have the typical problems that plague all of these pressure devices. So it's a matter of getting the tuning and the damping of this resonant system right. Because as with all pressure devices, it's a resonant system. And so you have to tune it, and you have to get the swing of this resonant device correct as well. And you do that through design and construction. So as I mentioned before, you tune it through the number of holes on the perforated sheet. But on top of that, how you deal with the cavity also affects the tuning. So for example, if you put porous absorption into the cavity in order to damp this resonant system, where you put this porous absorption, what gas flow resistance it has, how much of it you actually fill with porous absorption, all these affect the tuning frequency, because putting porous absorption in a cavity actually makes it acoustically larger. So there's always this kind of ping pong between damping the system correctly and also tuning it correctly, where the only thing that really helps is building a lot of these, gaining experience, gaining some understanding of what it is you need to do in order to actually get this right in practice. And then you have the other typical problems of constructing resonance absorbers, for example, not making the cavity airtight, just sort of missing something, and then the thing isn't airtight. Maybe you choose a thickness of the wood that isn't thick enough, so this box isn't hard, fully acoustically reflective at the frequencies that we care about. Yeah, so maybe some of the low frequency energy can actually escape the box. Perhaps some of the sides of your box can actually go into resonance themselves if you don't make this thing heavy enough. And then there's just the size of this thing, right? Typically we have to calculate somewhere around 100 liters, 200 liters of volume for this thing to actually work at these frequencies that we're interested in. Yeah, so imagine putting a fridge-sized wooden box in the corner of your room in order to just target one single frequency. That's the thinking that you have to go through in order to understand how these things actually work in practice. So for home studios, the obvious answer is that you really never want to use Helmholtz resonators. They are simply the wrong tool for the job. They are too big, too difficult, and also too narrow in their functionality in order to be an effective tool for treating home studios when we're dealing with small rooms, broadband issues across the spectrum, where we really need the tool that we're using for the treatment to cover as much of the spectrum as possible. Helmholtz resonators are really reserved for high-end studio builds, which are designed by experienced acousticians who've done this many times, who can also calculate and build from the ground up. Yeah, so they can actually plan where these resonators go in the room, but also as part of their treatment system from the very beginning. So they can size the room accordingly, make sure that these devices are in the right spots in this entire system that they're designing, and then they can actually get these to work properly and be effective as part of their entire treatment concept. Yeah, this isn't something for a home studio where you just follow a YouTube tutorial in order to fix this one issue that you have after having basically done everything else in your studio already, and it's filled with your gear and your furniture and acoustic treatment, and the whole thing is only really 10 by 12 feet in size. So obviously, again, in a home studio, how many would you need? None. But let's just imagine that we do have the space. Well, if you build them large enough, 1 unit per frequency can be enough. So this is a question of how much surface area this front plate, the perforated plate, actually covers. But so basically, as a general concept, maybe think 1 or 2 small refrigerator-sized units in order to target one frequency. That's kind of how many you'd need in order to actually get a particular single problem under control. And that brings me right to the pros and cons. Obviously, in terms of pros, if you get it to work, if you have the space, they work extremely well. On top of that, they are one of the few devices in this entire series that can actually reach extremely low frequencies. So you can tune these things to absorb 20, 30, 40 hertz in that range without any problem. Again, if you have the space to actually do it. But the cons for the home studio reality are many, as I already mentioned. First and foremost, they are notoriously difficult to actually get to work as you intended. And if you don't do that right, you can actually make the problems worse. There are reports on forums where people basically underdamp this resonant system. So it actually returns energy back into the room after the initial sound source has already stopped playing. So you can actually make a certain standing wave ring longer if you don't build this device the correct way, if you don't tune and damp it in the correct way. Of course, on top of that, there is the positioning problem that I talked about already and the size issue as well. And then obviously all of that trouble just to hit one single frequency. And so again, this makes them a very poor choice of tool for a home studio. And yes, I'm sure if you're now thinking, but I've read somewhere online about somebody building a Helmholtz Resonator with really effective and good results. My answer is yes, there is the odd example out there of somebody being successful with this, but just count the number of threads or examples of people trying this, sinking a lot of time and money into this without getting any effect whatsoever or even making things worse. There are far more examples of that than examples of people getting this right when they're basically designing and building them themselves. So if you're still thinking, I've got this 50 hertz problem, shouldn't I solve this with a Helmholtz Resonator? My answer is no. In a home studio, and especially at 50 hertz, which is still totally doable with porous absorption, porous bass traps are your best friend. They work broadband. They are insensitive to positioning. They are easy to use. They are cheap. That is the way you want to go in order to get your 50 hertz problem under control. And of course, if you want help with that, like finding the right material, finding something suitable for the insulation material in your area, the construction of the entire process, understanding how deep to actually make this thing, how to use an air gap to increase the performance, all of that I cover in my Build a Better Bass Trap course. I'll link that in the description as well. It's practical, it's tested, it's going to save you months of second guessing. But so in summary, what do I want you to take away from this video? First and foremost, yes, the maths works. And if you build them correctly, they work. But for a home studio, this just isn't the right tool. It's not so much the difficulty of actually calculating the right tuning frequency. It's a problem of building this thing in a way that it works and actually making room for it in your home studio. All right, next week we're diving into the realm of free hanging membranes, very mysterious types of bass traps. So be on the lookout for that. But with that, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.